There's a moment where cracks start showing up in the systems of power that we've always assumed were invincible. And I think we might be living through one of those moments right now. As scandals and horrific crimes surface and violence becomes harder to ignore, we're collectively confronting truths that marginalized communities have been forced to deal with and live with for generations. Today, I'm exploring what it means to face that darkness honestly, and why the gospel insists it will not have the final word. You're listening to Whiplash, a listener-supported podcast exploring Catholicism through the lens of queer liberation theology. I'm Max Kuzma. Thank you to our paid subscribers on Substack for making this show possible. Before we begin, I need to let you know that this episode contains discussion of sexual abuse, exploitation of minors, systemic violence, racism, anti-immigrant violence, and institutional corruption. Listener discretion is advised, especially for those who may have personal experience with these topics. Please take care of yourself, and feel free to pause or step away if you need to. So, lately, it feels like we've been living through a relentless flood of awful news. State violence against immigrants and citizens alike, the open cruelty of the prison industrial complex turned into the deportation industry, and the slow, sickening reveal of crimes committed by powerful men who were and have been protected for decades, including what continues to surface around the Epstein files. For many people, this moment is a huge reckoning, as if the world has suddenly become more dangerous or more corrupt than it was before. But the truth is probably harder to swallow. None of this is new. These systems of abuse, exploitation, and silence have always existed. And marginalized people, LGBTQ folks, Black Americans, undocumented families, and children, minors in general, have been living with these dangers, these warnings, and these betrayals for generations. What's changing now isn't the violence itself, but who is finally being forced to see it. Today, I want to talk about this idea of breaking the Epstein spell, disrupting the cultural and psychological phenomenon where systems of exploitation look invincible precisely because they depend on secrecy, intimidation, and our belief that we're powerless to do anything. The truth is much less glamorous and much more revealing. Systems of domination don't actually create much of anything. They extract, they exploit, they survive by draining the creativity, labor, and dignity of everyone else. From a theological perspective, this is not a new story. The gospel is full of moments where power looks overwhelming until it suddenly collapses under the weight of its own emptiness. And I think one of the hardest shocks many people are facing right now is realizing that the world they thought was stable, fair, or merit-based was actually built on systems that were always fragile, always exploitative, and always dependent on maintaining certain myths, especially myths rooted in racial hierarchy, economic inequality, and a very brittle form of masculinity that confuses domination itself with strength. So today we're going to talk about power, class, and solidarity. We're going to acknowledge that there isn't one single political framework that fully explains these realities. And instead, I want to place this conversation inside Catholic social teaching, not as a partisan tool, but as a moral and spiritual container that can help us imagine liberation, mutual aid, and genuine human dignity outside ideological battle lines. Because if exploitation depends on extraction, then liberation depends on creation. And if parasitic power feeds on fear and isolation, then solidarity becomes one of the most radical and sacred acts available to us. And maybe most importantly, if the gospel teaches us anything, it's that darkness has never needed to be defeated by becoming stronger than it. It's overcome by light that refuses to stop shining. I know that part is a little that part is a little bit like trite on some level. Like it's like, okay, yeah, like this little light of mine is going to save us. But it really is true. These really small, genuine acts of goodness mean so much more than power that is just exploitative, because again, they can't create anything new. They're just taking the light from many people, and that's what makes them seem like they have a lot of power. So one place that I want to start this conversation as well is kind of in the idea of unpacking what is assumed to be default assumptions about society. One of the most dangerous things about living inside unjust systems is how they train us to accept certain assumptions as normal. Assumptions that actually ultimately make everyone less safe. You see it in the way that people can talk after acts of violence. There are questions like, what was she wearing? Or why were they there? Or why didn't they leave sooner? These responses sound like common sense to some people, but what they really do is shift responsibility away from the person who caused the harm and place it onto the person who was harmed. Of course, sexual violence is one of the clearest examples of this. It's a crime where the survivors are often treated with suspicion rather than care. We don't usually ask burglary victims why they owned valuable things, like, why did you have a TV? And we don't ask someone who was assaulted in a mugging why they were walking down the street trying to go to work. But sexual violence is surrounded by myths that make people doubt survivors and misunderstand how these crimes actually happen. For example, there's a widespread belief that sexual assault is an impulsive act driven by uncontrollable desire. But research consistently shows that sexual assault is overwhelmingly about power and control, not sexual frustration. Many perpetrators plan their actions, deliberately seek out vulnerability, and often maintain ordinary public lives, including long-term romantic or sexual relationships. The myth of the uncontrollable monster lurking in the shadows is in some ways comforting because it feels like it makes the violence easier to identify. But the reality is often much more ordinary and therefore harder to confront, harder to accept. And you can see how this myth of uncontrollable male desire shows up in modern internet culture, especially in communities that identify as incels, short for involuntary celibates. While the term originally described people struggling with loneliness, it has evolved into an online subculture that often frames romantic rejection as evidence that society, and women in particular, are oppressing men. In many of these spaces, women are portrayed as gatekeepers of sex and status, and men who do not achieve romantic or sexual success are encouraged to see themselves as victims of a rigged social hierarchy. Instead of challenging harmful ideas about masculinity, intimacy, and entitlement, incel ideology often doubles down on them. It treats sexual access as something that men are owed, and when that imagined entitlement is denied, frustration can turn into resentment, dehumanization, and in some cases, real-world violence. We've seen multiple mass attacks explicitly linked to this worldview, where perpetrators frame their violence as revenge against women or society itself. And again, this connects back to the myth of uncontrollable desire. Incel culture often insists that men are biologically driven, visually ruled, and socially powerless in the face of rejection. But that narrative doesn't actually describe men, it reduces them. It strips men of moral agency, emotional depth, the capacity for mutual, consensual relationships built on dignity rather than conquest. It tells men that intimacy is something to win or lose, rather than something to build. Yeah, I really think that's an important point of, because intimacy is not something that you can just snap your fingers and have happen. There's this idea that, you catch somebody's eye and then that's the person that you're going to marry. But really, real relationships take work. They take time, investment of both people to talk through the things that are important to you and like wrestle with how do you express that and how is that important to you. That, there's so much more than just, conquest. And so reducing it to that is such a big problem. From a broader cultural and spiritual perspective, this is what also happens when systems built on domination collapse inward. So when masculinity is defined primarily through control, status, and sexual conquest, it actually becomes incredibly fragile. And so that fragility, when combined with entitlement, can become explosive. That's when the match is lit. When what incel ideology exposes is not just misogyny, but a profound crisis of meaning. A worldview that cannot imagine love, partnership, or community outside of hierarchy and competition. There's actually a show on Hulu right now, I think it's through FX, called The Beauty. It's a horror drama, and the main theme is that there are these supermodels who are mysteriously dying, which leads FBI agents to uncover a conspiracy involving a miraculous but dangerous beauty-enhancing virus that transforms people. I feel like there was a time. I'm not like, I don't know all of the films and shows that have been made on this theme, but I think there's been a lot. But at the same time, I think there has been a lapse for a while, but we're kind of seeing this topic come back a little bit. Another notable entry in the probably horror drama category would also be The Substance with Demi Moore, which I believe came out in 2024. I know that it won, the Oscars were in 2025, where it won an Oscar, an Academy Award for Best Makeup, I believe. But yeah, like I've been interested in this genre as emerging in this time, especially because it has been interesting to see kind of what they're unpacking. So beyond just like, obviously I want to be beautiful because I want to be successful. I think that's probably the base layer of why this storyline keeps coming up. But I think it's interesting because some of these, like The Beauty, is exploring different aspects as well. So in The Beauty, one of the episodes focuses on a character. He lives in his mom's basement. He doesn't have a job. He doesn't know how to talk to women, according to himself. Like it's that self-perpetuating thing. I don't know how to talk to women because women won't talk to me, and then, spiral there. And he also spends all of his time in adult chat rooms. And in this character's story, which is actually very uncomfortable to watch, it's really uncomfortable to watch somebody spiral so much like that. But someone in one of the chat rooms drops a phone number in there claiming that this is someone who can help you. It turns out to be the number of a plastic surgery office. And so when he gets there, what I thought was wild is that the surgeon straight up says to him, "You are an incel." And he's like, "What's an incel?" And I think it's like, it's one of those times where it's like, okay, is this a little heavy-handed in terms of how this theme is being presented through dialogue? Like, would a surgeon really say that? I don't know. But what I do know is I think it's a good example of showing how somebody can present this information to a young man that is in that, I guess, vulnerable headspace is how I see it. It's definitely, when I say vulnerable, I'm not trying to take away their agency or their privilege in the world, but vulnerable in the sense that they are very broken. And when this ideology is presented to them, it can feel like, now everything makes sense. Now I have an explanation for why all these things are happening to me. So it's very much a toxic reinforcement, but an unhealthy, very unhealthy. But I thought it was just really fascinating how the show took that approach. And it was also interesting because having that ideology reinforced actually makes him more violent and more dangerous, which makes sense. But like, I liked how they illustrated it is basically what I'm saying. But yeah, kind of a weird one, and definitely, again, horror drama, similar to The Substance. So like, if you don't like body horror, if you don't like gore, don't watch either of these. But if you are interested in kind of those psychological elements and you don't mind the gore, I would say definitely check those out, just to think deeply about some of these themes. Yeah, so I covered all of that about how uncomfortable it was. I have in my notes, extremely uncomfortable, because it is. It's uncomfortable to watch somebody descend into that level. But yeah, and the connection to how basically an individual's self-loathing, as expressed through this incel storyline, can be weaponized into a radicalization, something that we see throughout the manosphere. It's the manosphere where men will encounter that incel ideology, typically not in a plastic surgeon's office, I don't think. And the manosphere, of course, is a loose network of communities that claim to address men's struggles, dating, fitness, fatherhood, etc. But they often, and pretty much exclusively, I would say, promote harmful advice and attitudes. The United Nations Secretary General's report on violence against women and girls highlights these groups that are united by an opposition to feminism, and they misrepresent men as victims of the current social and political climate. So the type of myths promoted by incels and the manosphere don't just harm survivors after violence occurs. They also shape policies, institutions, and cultural attitudes that allow abuse to continue. When we make assumptions about, quote, the way the world is, we miss a lot of red flags. We overlook harm that happens within families, churches, schools, workplaces, and social circles. When we assume that safety can be achieved by like bubble wrapping any potential victims, controlling how they dress, where they go, who is trustworthy, we ignore the fact that violence happens because someone chooses to commit it. And this is part of a much larger pattern. Systems built on domination depend on narratives that redirect accountability downward. They teach us to monitor the vulnerable instead of confronting those who exploit vulnerability. And the tragic result is that everyone becomes less safe because the real sources of harm remain protected, hidden, or normalized. Breaking those assumptions is uncomfortable. It forces us to admit that violence is not usually random and it is not inevitable. It's enabled, it's tolerated, and because of that, it can also be challenged. So I want to turn now to the topic of collective trauma. I think that this is an important element to go into because I see a lot of people who are like, this has never happened before, and then Black people are like, excuse me. Have you not heard of slavery and the things that happened to our community? Which I think is a very, very important point. But I also do see this as this big rupture as well. So it's kind of a both and. It's both of those things I think can be true. And so I kind of just want to talk about how so many of us had a storyline that we were taught from a very young age about how life was supposed to go, like whatever version that may have taken. Maybe it came from our parents, maybe it came from school, maybe it came from church, or maybe it was just the general American culture. It's this idea that if you work hard, you play by the rules, you stay morally upright, whatever that really means, and you follow like the path and the milestones that you're supposed to follow, you're supposed to be able to then build stability, and and critically, you earn security, and you're going to be okay if you just follow the plan. So, one example of that is this idea of the 9-to-5 white-collar job, the steady climb towards home ownership that's supposed to be affordable and accessible. Healthcare is supposed to be, part of this, and your employer is supposed to take care of you by providing you this health care. There's so many problems within this that we're not going to go into at this exact moment, but the broader premise of the American dream, the idea that your effort is what will lead to your safety and success. And here's another part where, like disabled people would like a word, like this was never inclusive, but I think it was always being sold. And that's kind of what I want to unpack here. So what many people are confronting now is the realization that the system was never as stable or even as merit-based as it claimed to be. The corporate and financial interests have always been working to carve off just a little bit more for themselves, a few extra percentage points of profit, a slightly higher quarterly return. I always joke and say it's like higher number makes brain go burr. Like it's really just like, I want to see that number go up. But those tiny margins that create enormous rewards for executives and shareholders completely drain the resources that the workers, the ordinary people, rely on to survive. Those incremental extractions show up as wages that stagnate, even as productivity rises, as healthcare becomes more expensive and less accessible, as groceries and housings that swallow larger portions of a family's income. Workers are expected to produce more and more without any cut of the profits made. And often this works because it's gradual. People are just accepting that it's just getting a little bit tighter and a little bit tighter and a little bit tighter. But over time, it's completely stripping away people's financial, emotional, and even spiritual bandwidth. When all you can do is survive and you're surviving paycheck to paycheck, you're not able to live. You're not able to have any mental bandwidth to dream, to create art, to do the things that really make us human. And one of the most dangerous byproducts of this pressure is how it encourages rigid black and white thinking, especially politically and morally. And I really do see that, when people are living with real or perceived scarcity, mostly real, they are far more likely to see social issues as zero-sum battles. So if one group gains safety or recognition, it can feel like another group must be losing something. Think of the incels with this idea that, women, because women have agency, independence, they're choosing to reject men, and men now are the ones who are the victims, rather than seeing it as, okay, women now have this opportunity to seek out and do the things that they want to do. They have independence and agency. That's a good thing. And then how can I, be an attractive mate to that person? I'm not entitled to that. How can I actually, seek that person and pursue them in a way that they would appreciate and would recognize? I just think it's so, on some level it's embarrassing, this idea that feeling like you're owed something rather than viewing dating as something that you can pursue and achieve in a healthy growth and development way. It will make you a better person to embark on that quest. I really think that. And so anyway, that again, that's a little bit of a backtrack there, but really this idea of you gaining something means, or another group gaining something means that you're losing something. And also specifically the idea of the black and white thinking that is promoted so that, politically and morally, so that it makes it much harder for you to make decisions that actually holistically support community. Do you know what I mean? Instead of being able to think complexly about how an issue could affect your community, you're given this script, this black and white script where it's there's a prioritization that really corporate interests have set, because they know that if they use this moral issue as a as a breaking point for you, like as this is the most important thing, they can throw a bunch of other stuff that benefits them in there, and you'll be forced to accept it because you believe that you have to follow this black and white path. That's kind of the point that I am getting at there. And obviously, this black and white thinking, these moral claims connected to this reality of scarcity, metastasizes into unquestioned absolutes, complex human realities flattened into slogans, entire groups of people who become symbols of social decline or moral threat. We can see that very clearly with immigration policies right now, and against anybody marginalized, for real. It becomes much easier to manipulate people when they are exhausted, afraid, and convinced that their survival depends on protecting their side of an imagined cultural battlefield. So that's the state of the bad. Now I have a section that moves into a little bit more of a positive direction, and it is titled Another Way to Live. So there's another way to live. There are paths towards liberation that do not require us to abandon moral conviction or our spiritual identity. In fact, liberation often demands a deeper, more honest engagement with our values. We can hold strong ethical beliefs while still honoring the dignity, freedom, and humanity of other people, which is huge. We can reject exploitation without turning our neighbors into enemies. We can build systems rooted in solidarity instead of competition, because, there's good competition, but there's many bad versions of competition. From a theological perspective, this is where Catholic social teaching offers something radically hopeful. It refuses both the myth that markets can guarantee human flourishing and the myth that human dignity should or can be sacrificed for efficiency, growth, or ideological purity. Very important. It insists that every person carries inherent worth, that economic life must serve human life, not the other way around, and that genuine freedom is always tied to the well-being of the community. So once the illusion of power starts to crack, we are no longer forced to defend a system that was never built to protect most people in the first place. And the rupture, the reckoning, as painful as it is, can become the starting point for imagining something more honest, humane, and ultimately more aligned with the kind of justice that the gospel calls us towards. So Catholic social teaching was born in the midst of a crisis. The modern tradition really begins during the Industrial Revolution, when rapid economic transformation, does that sound familiar at all with all this AI stuff, created enormous wealth for some people, while trapping workers, families, and entire communities in poverty and exploitation. So this is where the Pope Leo, who is the namesake of our current Pope, so Pope Leo XIII in 1891, his encyclical Rerum Novarum, of New Things, is considered the foundational document, addressing the exploitation of workers, poverty, and the rise of both laissez-faire capitalism and socialism. The Church asked a fundamental question that still echoes today. What does the gospel demand in a world where systems themselves are producing inequality and suffering? So, at its core, Catholic social teaching begins with the deceptively simple claim that every human person possesses inherent sacred dignity. And honestly, most people that are Catholic or are Christian will agree to this. They've just have then kind of built these other strict systems of rigidity that essentially lead them to working against this main point. But I really like the way that Catholic social teaching takes you through 7 different principles that kind of illustrate and flesh out what is meant here. So human dignity not based on anything, not based on productivity, citizenship, wealth, conformity, or moral perfection. Just flat out the gate, you have human dignity. Just dignity because you exist and are loved by God. And if you take this idea seriously, it disrupts many of the systems that we take for granted in the US, like unchecked capitalism or the current iteration of Christian nationalism that we see flying all around unchecked in society. Catholic social teaching measures any economy, government, cultural norm, and institution not by how efficient or profitable it is, but by whether it protects and nurtures human life. I mean, it's not saying any life is better than the other. It's saying, does this nurture and protect human life? That principle alone challenges almost everything we've been talking about. It challenges systems that treat workers as disposable. It challenges cultures that blame survivors instead of confronting violence. It challenges political frameworks that treat certain groups as threats instead of neighbors. It challenges the idea that your family or your nation is more important than welcoming the stranger. Catholic social teaching insists that people are always more important than things. Another key pillar of Catholic social teaching is what's called the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable. It doesn't mean that some people matter more than others. It means that if you want to morally evaluate a society, you look first at how it treats those with the least power: the poor, migrants, racial minorities, LGBTQ people, children, the elderly, the disabled, anybody pushed to the margins. The gospel repeatedly centers these groups, not as charity cases, but as moral anchors. Their safety and dignity become a test of whether a society is just at all. Catholic social teaching also speaks directly to economic life. It rejects the idea that markets should operate without moral boundaries, insisting that the economy exists to serve people, not the other way around. Work is understood as participation in God's ongoing creation, which means workers have rights to fair wages, to safe conditions, to organize collectively, to live lives that allow rest, family, and community. When work becomes purely extractive, when profit consistently outruns human well-being, Catholic tradition names that as a moral failure, not just as an unfortunate side effect of growth, which is, I think, honestly, how capitalism is so often treated. It's like, it's unfortunate that some people have to work 3 jobs to survive, but that's just how it is. And it's like, well, no, we can make it so that people don't have to work 3 jobs just to survive. Like, it doesn't have to be that way. And all jobs have dignity too. Like, that's another huge part that I think Catholic social teaching speaks to and is also really missing in our society, is just how disposable and just how people are treated by elite wealth and capitalism, So we know that American culture has an incredibly disordered relationship to work. I feel like that is an understatement. And it stems from the workaholism of our Puritan ancestors, who saw downtime as a doorway to sin and the devil. Like, the people who, really colonized this country and made it started what is today. They were workaholics. They didn't want to sit around. They thought that would welcome Satan in. Overcoming that mentality is a huge challenge for our society and the time that we live in. Though I have been particularly impressed by trends in the younger generation that reject the idea of work as all-consuming and seem to have at least some better boundaries, partially because they are facing down such vast economic inequality, and they're seeing that even if they were to be these perfect little worker bees, they're not going to be able to afford the basics, even to afford the basics. So what is the point of sacrificing your entire life if the system views you that poorly, that with such disdain, And so, yeah, I've been impressed by the way that younger people push back against that and say, well, we're not going to play along if you're, to that extent, if you're going to treat us this way. But yeah, continuing with social teaching, next we can touch on solidarity. Solidarity is one of the most radical and countercultural ideas the church offers because it says we are responsible for each other across borders, across identities, across political differences. It rejects the scarcity narrative telling us that one group's dignity must come at the other's expense or that there's some sort of ranking. Solidarity insists that human flourishing is interconnected. Liberation is never individual or isolated, but communal. Liberation as a communal operation, as something that requires all of us working together. So finally, Catholic social teaching reminds us that all of this is rooted in relationships with each other and with creation itself. Caring for the earth, caring for communities, caring for social systems. These are not separate moral issues. They are interconnected expressions of how we understand what it means to live as people created in the image of God. Catholic social teaching refuses simplistic answers. It doesn't tell us to blindly trust markets, governments, or ideologies. It asks us to constantly evaluate systems through the lens of human dignity, community well-being, and justice. It gives us moral stability without demanding rigid black and white thinking. In many ways, Catholic social teaching is the church saying storms will come, empires will rise and fall, economic systems will evolve, sometimes violently, but the measure of faithfulness never changes. Protect human dignity, stand with the vulnerable, build communities rooted in solidarity, and insist that every structure of power answer to the demands of justice and mercy. That doesn't remove the storm, but it gives us a way to walk through it without losing our moral center and without losing each other. So at the end of the day, what we're really up against right now isn't evil geniuses. It's not inevitability or an unshakable force of nature. So the kind of power we see that dominates, exploits, and terrorizes, whether in governments, corporations, cultural institutions, is fundamentally empty. It can only take. It can only extract, consume, and manipulate. It cannot create, nurture, or love. Its strength is a mirage built on the labor, energy, and lives of everyone else. And the more it takes, the more fragile it actually becomes because it has nothing of its own to sustain it. And that's why, if you have the ability to build, to care, to create, to share, to listen, to love, you are the opposite of that parasitic power. You carry something they can never touch. You are the light of the world. Your creativity, your empathy, your generosity, that is the source of true strength, and that's why it scares them. This is what endures. This is what transforms, heals, and overcomes. You don't have to be a CEO, a politician, a revolutionary figure to make a difference. Building can be as simple as mentoring a young person, teaching someone a skill, sharing knowledge that empowers others. Caring can mean checking in on a neighbor. And that's really an important thing right now. Even no matter where we are in the country is checking in with our neighbors, knowing our neighbors, being with our neighbors, feeding someone who is hungry, volunteering your time at a local shelter or a community organization. And creating can be writing, making art, organizing spaces of welcome, or helping start a community garden. Sharing can mean giving your resources, your attention, or your platform to uplift someone who is otherwise ignored or marginalized. Listening can be revolutionary. Simply giving someone the dignity of being heard can change the course of their life and strengthen the bonds of a community. Sometimes even the most small moment of listening to somebody or sharing with somebody, in a checkout line, it can change the whole course of their day. And love, real, patient, courageous love, has a way of seeding hope that no extractive power can ever destroy. Love is 1 + 1 = 3, and that's something no corporate mindset will ever be able to understand. Every act of generosity, Empathy, solidarity, is a refusal to participate in the extraction and exploitation that fills our headlines. Every small choice to build rather than tear down, to include rather than exclude, to protect rather than harm, chips away at the illusion of unstoppable power. And the more people practice these acts, the more they accumulate, creating ripples that reach far beyond what we can see in the present moment, which is a really key point. So don't be fooled by the spectacle of empty authority. Don't be intimidated by the illusion of unstoppable power. Yes, we are in the midst of a reckoning, and yes, it will be overwhelming and painful a lot of the time. But the world doesn't ultimately belong to those who take. It belongs to those who give. It belongs to those who build, who love, who shine. Even a single act of generosity, a single word of encouragement, a single choice to protect the dignity of another human being is an act of light in a world that too often allows the darkness in. And no matter how loud or violent the darkness is, it will never have the final word. That's it for today's episode of Whiplash. Thank you so much to our listeners and especially to our paid subscribers on Substack. Your support makes this work possible and keeps it free and accessible for everyone. If today's conversation resonated with you, I encourage you to take a moment to think about the ways you can be a light in your own life and community, whether that is through small acts of care, solidarity, or even creation. Every choice to protect dignity, to build rather than extract, and to love in the face of oppression matters. You can find Whiplash on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to continue the conversation, share your thoughts or reflections with us in the comments. We'd love to hear how you're living out these ideas in your own world. Until next time, keep questioning, keep creating, and keep your light shining.